Friday, June 16th, 2023 at 2:16 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, Quant CEO Gilbert Verdian just came out and confirmed years of research and speculation from the quant community. Over the past few years, we've looked and speculated upon hints of collaboration with some massive players, with guys like the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, the Bank for International Settlements, UK's government infrastructure, which of course includes the Bank of England. In one single tweet and article, Gilbert Verdian pretty much just confirmed and revealed the truth behind everything. Well, almost everything. There's still some left to be uncovered, but then again, these things take time. But regardless, this announcement and reveal is definitely worth some coverage. I'm Tokenicer, and I'm here to bring you guys in-depth research and analysis from the digital asset space, along with covering the progressive tokenization of the world. Be sure to check out Tokenicer.network for all my other content platforms directly in one spot, from my Twitter threads, Spotify podcasts, Medium articles, and much more. That'll be right down in the description below. Now, before we continue any further, I just got to remind you guys, nothing you ever hear or read from me will be any form of financial advice. But with that said, let's dive right down the rabbit hole. So for those of us who have been around for some time now, we've been talking about these things for a while now. If you're not all caught up with the quant ecosystem yet, be sure to check out the Quant Network deep dive we did a while back, as a lot of the speculation in this was uncovered in this specific tweet, which we're about to uncover. So if you haven't checked that out, be sure to take that deep dive first and then come right back. I promise everything will make a lot more sense, and it's definitely worth the 1 hour rabbit hole. So to start off, let's just read the actual tweet Gilbert had put out. I'm incredibly proud to be able to announce that Quant Network has been collaborating with the Bank for International Settlements and the Bank of England on Project Rosalind, a project designing and implementing a CBDC API and platform and testing use cases for CBDCs with financial service participants. We were chosen to provide the technology because of our history of innovation, expertise in financial services, and deep experience in payments. Previously running mission-critical infrastructure, only we can do what the project needed from a technology partner and payments expert. The project has produced tangible real-world examples that tested how CBDCs could support a more digitalized economy in the future, working with participants like the Bank of Canada, Barclays, Mastercard, and Amazon, who built and tested new CBDC payment flows on the platform. CBDCs are coming. I encourage every bank and financial institution to read the Project Rosalind report and start planning their smart money infrastructure strategy. And then below, Gilbert linked a couple articles that talked a little more on the operations of all of this, and we'll shortly get into that. Let's first address the tweet itself. Needless to say, this was a pretty big statement, right? Gilbert pretty much confirmed some of the biggest hidden partnerships that Quant had under wraps for quite some time now. And many of these were ones we've previously covered, were all relating to some of the things that Gilbert was talking about. So let's turn back the clock a bit and look to some of the research we've previously done and see how all these things line up. The main parties discussed here were the Bank for International Settlements. This is the central bank of central banks. Any developed country's central bank is probably a member of the BIS, and even a lot of developing countries' central banks. Then there's the Bank of England, which we of course know Gilbert had spent his fair share of time at, and likely still has some really close connections given the UK adoption of Overledger. There's also the Bank of Canada, which we of course have also seen some potential uses and collaborations with Overledger. Mastercard, which we of course know Gilbert, Martin, and Colin all had worked there previously with one of their subsidiaries in Vocalink. And then it also mentions Amazon and Barclays, which are two collaborations we haven't quite heard much from yet. The list of this large-scale partnership is focused on the development around Project Rosalind, which was a test to create API prototypes for retail CBDC innovations, which lines up pretty well with what Quant is doing, right? They're an agnostic API gateway to connect blockchains and legacy technology together. Now, we won't cover every part of the document, But some highlights in here are like the key findings they listed, where they mentioned standardized sets of API functionalities, an API able to connect with different central bank ledgers, and their respective and different roles in CBDCs. This experiment used a two-tiered CBDC model, which shows that individuals and businesses could manage their CBDC balances held at a central bank ledger, but also make payments and interact through your everyday commercial private sector bank and payment providers. So think like a Citibank or a PayPal, Visa, or Mastercard. And so because of this two-tiered model, it requires an API layer that's able to communicate and pass instructions from these service providers to the central bank ledger. Since the service provider is kind of the interface at this point, and the API is connecting it to the central bank ledger to relay the information, you can kind of think of this like you're at a restaurant. The waiter comes to your table and asks what you'd like, and say you order a steak. Well, the waiter then goes back to the kitchen to relay your order to the chef to cook it up and everything. Well, in this scenario, you would be the individual or business interacting with the service providers. Then, of course, the waiter relaying the messages and doing all the communications, like serving you, would be the payment provider and banks. And finally, the central bank would be the chef, as they're the ones actually moving the assets, or in this case, cooking up the steak. Moving on, this section covers what exactly Rosalind is testing for, and that's the functionality, interoperability, adoption, and ecosystem use cases around APIs and their role in a CBDC ecosystem. Down below, we can see a graph laying out how this ecosystem will flow exactly. So of course, we see the central bank ledger at the bottom, then the service providers and individuals over top, and of course the API layer sitting right in the middle. This simply shows that there's an API layer between us interacting with the service providers, between the central bank ledger, as again, the API is the one giving these instructions to the central bank ledger. With the APIs sitting over top of the central bank, it proves and shows functionality of the API. Add the service provider on top, and now you're seeing some interoperability between different systems and networks. The API sitting between the service providers that we interact on provides the adoption, as it creates a really seamless and easy to understand experience, given that we'd only really need to know how to interact with these existing payment platforms. And finally, when we put it all together, we get a full functioning ecosystem of CBDC payments that are essentially as seamless as the digital banking world we're already in today. And this leads me to another point, which is something I've been saying for some time now. And it's that 99% probably won't even notice when we switch over to a CBDC system. If you're watching this video, you probably will, given that you're spending your time learning how our global financial system works. But the goal is to make it as smooth and seamless of a switch, which probably means that most citizens won't even notice when the flip is switched. They then mentioned the two different phases in this approach, with phase 1 focused on designing, developing, and integrating these API functions. And then phase 2 was more on the use cases and actually engaging in tests and proof of concepts that would apply to a CBDC ecosystem. In March 2023, there was a Rosalind tech sprint which saw 23 teams participate in testing out this framework. Unfortunately, it doesn't state who exactly these 23 teams are, but we could probably imagine that they're of a similar caliber, or maybe some of the entities that Gilbert had listed in this tweet, given that this is probably a pretty high-level testing sandbox that the Bank for International Settlements and Bank of England open to only a specific group of entities. There's also this graphic which kind of just breaks down the project architecture, which I'll go over quickly. So, of course, there's the central bank ledger. They tested both account-based and token-based ledgers to test whether the core API layer could abstract the differences in different ledgers away. For the account-based ledgers, they use Hyperledger Besu, and for the token-based ledgers, they use Hyperledger Fabric. Then there's the ledger API layer. This is focused on translating smart contracts to API calls and transform API requests, and doing so while exploring on how different types of central bank ledgers could connect and interact with this API layer. And the really cool thing here is that Overledger is literally mentioned as the core technology used, which of course is saying a lot, given that this is a document by the Bank of England and the Bank of International Settlements. And then adding to the Ledger API layer is the core API layer. And this is pretty much just an end-to-end encryption of the data between service providers for security and data privacy purposes. And the report came out that all the APIs used were compliant with financial grade API standards and with transport layer security authentication. So as usual, great to hear the regulatory compliance side isn't a worry for Quant. And then the service provider layer, this is of course the end user interacting with these specific payment providers, which would include the front-end CBDC use cases. Now that's about all we'll cover regarding this BIS document itself. As we can see, the main points we got out of that were this solution used multiple technologies in legacy payment providers and a distributed ledger for the CBDC. The API gateway, or API layer in this case, was the core solution in the sense that it relayed, encrypted, and carried out all the communications from the platform to the central bank ledger. And then of course the technology used for the API layer was confirmed to be Overledger, while the other chains they used were both Hyperledger modules. So overall, a lot of good stuff. This multi-layered CBDC approach seems to be the most reasonable and seamless from a retail standpoint for sure. And I guess we kind of already knew that Quant played a role in this, given that during the Financial Times Live event this year, the director of fintech at the Bank of England, Tom Mutton, was speaking with Gilbert on stage and literally said that Gilbert and Quant were key pieces to Project Rosalind. But hearing it like this is definitely something different. Now, one more recent partner of Quant's that we haven't quite talked much about yet is UST. No, not the UST that was made by Do Kwon and rugged the whole markets. This UST. They're a tech and business consultancy company, and some of their services and tools include marketing, enterprise applications, software as a service, data analytics, cloud, and more that we can see here. And here in their partner ecosystem, we can see some really big names. There's Microsoft, Oracle, Google Cloud, SAP, ServiceNow, Salesforce, Adobe, Intel, and even MIT and Stanford's computer science and AI programs. So yeah, UST is a pretty big name in the enterprise space, and seeing Quant partner with them back in November of 2022 was a great add to their partner list. Well, believe it or not, they're actually the technology consultant for Project Rosalind. So that's really interesting, right? And it should really make you think what else these two are involved and collaborating on, especially when you pair up the connections between both of them. So the Rosalind report itself highlights enough of how Quant is intertwined with both the Bank of International Settlements and the Bank of England. But Gilbert also confirmed a few other entities. One of these was the Bank of Canada. Well, in case you guys have forgotten, we'd previously gone down this whole rabbit hole on Quant's connections to Canada. And maybe I'm just a bit biased as a Canadian myself, but I'd say we're doing a pretty decent job at capturing the regulated innovation of DLT lately. So I'm not going to run you guys the whole rabbit hole because that might take up the whole video, but here's a quick summary. To start, Canada's CBDC project is titled Jasper, but even before all that, the groundwork was laid. Remember how we were talking about VocaLink? This was the Mastercard acquired payments company that Gilbert Verdian, Martin Hargreaves, the Quant CPO, and Colin Patterson, one of the Quant co-founders, had all previously worked at, holding some really high-level positions, and they even won Payment Infrastructure of the Year back in 2017. Well, the Bank of Canada actually also partnered with them for their real-time gross settlement system back in 2020. But that's not really saying too much, right? Gilbert and the rest of the guys at Quant were out of there by then already. Now, let's add this in here. We of course know that Quant had partnered with SIA to connect 550 banks together, with the Bank of Canada being one of these banks under SIA. So it makes sense that Canada had also partnered with SIA to be their application for their high-value payment system links. So that's two correspondent partners right there, right? And now when we look at some of the Jasper papers, we can see the participants listed here. And we see Payments Canada, various commercial banks in Canada, such as CIBC, TD, BMO, and then there's R3, which we know Quant has collaborated with on multiple occasions, including solving interoperability with their core product Corda during the SIA collaborations. And continuing on a little more on Project Jasper, we also see that it was mentioned alongside one of the Project Ubin papers, in which Jasper and Ubin were testing interoperability. Of course, the key mention in this paper was on API gateways. So, things are definitely lining up now. In the global integration segments, we mention a standardized interoperability protocol. Well, doesn't that sound a lot like what Quant's doing with TC307 and SATP? And then they mention ISO down here in standardizing DLTs, along with R3 having a similar goal in mind. I don't think I really need to point out those hints there. And then just last year, we of course also saw the Bank of Canada's senior deputy governor, Timothy Lane, go on stage with Gilbert Verdian, Thomas Harjano from MIT, and Charlotte Hogg, the CEO of Visa Europe, come on to discuss CBDCs, which kind of seems like a really random panel that they just threw together until you look behind the scenes. As we know, MIT and Quant are the co-authors of SATP. We just mentioned some of the connections behind the scenes with Quant and Canada, so I'm not saying this confirms it whatsoever, but it's strange how out of all central banks and all banking participants, Canada was chosen. And then in Visa's UPC paper, so Universal Payments Channel, they had highlighted SATP, well, it was called ODAP at the time, along with some other work with Thomas Harjano and Martin Hargreaves. So now it's really tying it all together. We know that most CBDC projects are in some way or form affiliated or overseen by the Bank for International Settlements, and we also know that R3 is not only the leading DLT for CBDC development, but also was mentioned by the Bank of Canada. Well, in case you haven't heard of Daniel Iden, let me give you a quick introduction to him. He began his career with 3 years in the Israel Defense Forces as a combat commander. Then his official career in this whole enterprise DLT space began when he took the position at R3, starting as a sales engineer for Corda specific service sales. And it was around this time he also joined Standards Council Canada as a committee member for mandating and promoting standardization here. And the specific standard he was a member for was, of course, none other than ISO TC307. Sometime between that, he also joined Morpheus Network as an advisor, another project we consistently talk about around here. He also joined the International Telecommunications Union in 2020 as a committee member to their Digital Global Currency Initiative around architecture, interoperability, and use cases. And as we know, the International Telecommunications Union, or the ITU, does have a joint license standard group with ISO, and TC307 is indeed one of them. If you'd like to learn more about the ITU, which is a United Nations governed organization for tech innovations, be sure to check my interview with ITU LACChain TC307 and INAPA committee member Ismail Arribas, where we discuss the DLT industry as a whole, in addition to all the other different experiences he's had with standardizing the blockchain space under ISO TC307 with a large group of other entities. The link will be right up here in the top corner, but going back to the main topic. You guys may have noticed that there were 2 participants in Gilbert's tweet that we did not yet highlight, with these 2 being Barclays and Amazon. And realistically, there wasn't much I could find on these guys in regards to Project Rosalind, if at all. But just going on assumption, I would imagine Barclays was potentially one of the banks and teams that trialed Rosalind when they held that tech sprint, which kind of makes sense given that Barclays is headquartered in London, UK. And then as for Amazon, my guess is that they were the technology service and server providers for the project through AWS. But again, that's just going off of my assumption. And now, a couple final points. Back in February 7th of 2023, we saw John Cunliffe, the Deputy Governor for Financial Stability for the Bank of England, had come out publicly stating that there was a dire need for a digital pound. Well, we know Quant had already been collaborating on a digital pound with the Digital Pound Foundation for a couple years on that regard. But then in January of this year, Rosalind went into full testing mode, with opening an expressive interest for participants, an updated report on their findings, and more. So it's really interesting to see how all these dates and events seem to line up. And well, just to make it interesting for you guys and to get you guys thinking a little more, if you remember our most recent video on the Quant transactions from Coinbase 10, notice how a lot of those wallet transfers and transactions between those matching large wallets all happened around January to March of this year. This was the exact same time that Rosalind was open for testing by other chosen participants, and of course that was ran on Quant's Overledger. It's really interesting how all that's lining up, hey? And now, just to recap some of the main points throughout this report before we finish it off, Quant and Gilbert are confirmed collaborating with England's banking infrastructure more than ever before. Many of the uncovered partners we've been speculating on were pretty much revealed. There's a strategic way to how these partnerships have been formed, as seen with UST's role in this operation. And last but not least, Rosalind uses a two-tiered and multi-architecture platform of retail interacting with the familiar pre-existing interfaces of legacy payment system providers, while relaying and connecting that to a central bank ledger, a legacy to DLT operation that can only be carried out at scale by a solution like Overledger. So that's about it for this breakdown or update, whatever you guys want to call it. I know we just did a quant video recently, but this news was most definitely deserving of being highlighted. I promise our next video won't be another quant one, but it'll likely be something focused on the render network. So all in all, it's beautiful to see all the hard work and research the community in quant had been putting in over all these years officially pretty much come to light in one tweet by Gilbert. And of course, the evidence backing all of that. But as we know, we're still just at the tip of the iceberg, and there's much more to still uncover, from the connections we've laid out with Meta to the other entities adopting SATP, white label services, and many others that we'll have to continue looking for. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button while turning that ringer on to help with the algorithm and making sure that you don't miss a thing. And while you're at it, be sure to check out Tokenicer.network for all my content platforms linked right in one spot. From my YouTube videos, Spotify podcasts, interviews, Twitter threads, Medium articles, and much more. As always, that'll be right down in the link below. But as always, guys, I hope everyone enjoyed this and got some good value out of it. And be sure to stay safe and keep learning. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.